The rain poured down from a black sky, hitting the metal rooftops with a sharp sound. The narrow street was almost empty. Only the faint hum of neon signs and the drip of water from broken pipes could be heard. Puddles formed on the cracked ground, reflecting the dull glow of streetlights in the middle of this wet and cold night. A woman bent over a pile of trash near the back wall of an old building. Her skin was pale with a faint silver glow. Her long hair stuck to her cheeks, wet from the rain, and her pointed ears twitched slightly whenever she heard footsteps in the distance. She was not human, and anyone passing by could see that. Her clothes were torn and muddy, hanging loosely from her thin frame. Her hands shook as she moved broken boxes and wet paper aside, searching for something, anything, that could be eaten. The smell was terrible, but she didn't care. A small figure sat under a broken awning a few steps away. It was a little girl, no more than 6 years old, with the same pale skin and pointed ears as the woman. The girl's big eyes followed her mother's every movement. She hugged a thin blanket around her shoulders, but it was soaked through. Her lips trembled, both from cold and from hunger. Every few seconds, her small stomach growled. She said nothing, but her eyes silently begged for food. The woman's heart ached every time she looked back. She was supposed to protect her child, not let her shiver and starve. The rain made the trash heavy and hard to move. Her fingers were numb, but she kept digging. Sometimes she found a piece of bread or fruit, but it was moldy or rotten. She would sniff it, sigh, and throw it back. She could not risk her child getting sick. Passersby walked by without stopping. Some looked at her with pity, most with disgust. She heard one man whisper to another, "Disgusting alien beggar." Another woman shook her head and said loudly, "Go back to your own planet." The alien mother kept her head down, trying to ignore them. She had heard these words many times before, but they still hurt. Her thoughts went back to the time before all this, before the war that destroyed her home, before her husband was taken by soldiers, before she had to run with her daughter. She remembered the warmth of their small home, the smell of bread baking, her daughter laughing, but the memory was like a knife, because now all she had was this cold, wet street. Finally, her hand touched something soft. She pulled out a small piece of bread wrapped in wet paper. It was not fresh, but it didn't look too bad. Her chest tightened with relief. She could at least give her child something to eat tonight. But as she turned, a voice spoke behind her. "Don't eat that. It's not safe." She froze, her body tensed, and she slowly turned her head. A man stood there in the rain, holding a black umbrella. His clothes were simple, but clean, his eyes calm, but focused on her. She didn't know him, and that made her nervous. Humans in this district were not known for kindness toward aliens. She clutched the bread tighter, unsure if he wanted to take it from her. The man stepped closer, his boots splashing in the puddles. He bent down, his eyes meeting hers. "I can give you fresh food," he said softly. She shook her head, unsure if this was a trick. Many times before, people had lured desperate aliens with false promises only to humiliate them. Her daughter peeked out from under the awning, eyes wide. The man noticed and glanced at the child. Something changed in his expression. He reached into a bag he carried and pulled out a warm bread roll wrapped in clean paper. "Here," he said, holding it out. "It's safe." The smell reached her even in the rain. It was fresh, soft, and warm. Her stomach ached at the scent, but she hesitated. Her instincts told her to be careful. Her daughter's soft whimper made her decide. Slowly, she took the bread, her cold fingers brushing his warm hand for a second. She murmured something in her own language. A quiet thank you. The man nodded, saying nothing. He looked at her again, his voice steady. "Where is your home?" She lowered her eyes and whispered, "We have none." For a moment, they stood there in the rain. The sound of water hitting the ground filled the silence. The man glanced again at the small girl. Shivering and holding the blanket tightly, he took a slow breath and said, "Come with me. I'll get you a meal." The alien mother's heart pounded. She didn't trust humans easily, but the hunger and the cold were too strong. She looked back at her daughter, who nodded without speaking. The woman rose slowly, still holding the bread, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed a small spark of hope to enter her heart. The rain kept falling as the man led them away from the trash pile. His umbrella was big enough to cover only himself, so the alien mother and her child still walked under the cold drops. But somehow, the presence of this stranger made the night feel less dangerous. She walked a few steps behind him, clutching the warm bread roll like it was gold. Her daughter followed close, one hand gripping her mother's torn coat, the other holding the blanket tight around her shoulders. The man glanced back now, and then, checking if they were keeping up. He didn't speak much, and she was grateful for that. Too many questions from strangers usually meant trouble. When they passed a group of humans standing outside a shop, the voices began again. "Look at that, bringing aliens around here," one of them muttered. The alien mother's stomach nodded. She had heard worse insults, but hearing them in front of her child still burned. The man didn't reply to them. He just kept walking, his head straight. They stopped in front of a small diner tucked between two taller buildings. Its sign flickered, casting soft yellow light onto the wet ground. Warm air and the smell of cooking drifted out as the man pushed the door open. She hesitated, standing at the entrance. The bright light inside felt too safe, too clean for someone like her to step into. Her daughter tugged at her hand, eyes wide with wonder. The man noticed their hesitation and said simply, "It's all right, come in." They stepped inside, and warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. The mother blinked as her eyes adjusted. The diner was small, with a few wooden tables and chairs, and an old counter with glass jars of cookies. The smell of fresh bread and hot soup made her feel lightheaded. A few customers turned to stare, some curious, others clearly disapproving. She could feel their eyes like weight on her back. Her daughter tried to hide behind her. The man ignored the stares and guided them to a corner booth. He disappeared behind the counter for a moment, then returned carrying a tray. On it was a steaming bowl of stew, thick with vegetables and pieces of meat, and 2 more warm bread rolls. The mother froze for a second, staring at the food. It had been so long since she had seen a meal that looked this good. The man set the tray down and slid the bowl toward her. "Eat," he said. "It's safe." She reached for the spoon, then stopped and handed it to her daughter first. The little girl looked up at her mother, then slowly dipped the spoon into the stew. Her small lips closed around the food, and her eyes widened. She swallowed quickly and took another spoonful. The mother felt her chest tighten with relief at seeing her child eat. She reached for a piece of bread and took a bite herself. The soft, warm taste filled her mouth, and for a moment she forgot the cold street outside. The man sat across from them, not eating, just watching quietly. After a while, he spoke. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Lyara." He nodded. "And your little one?" The girl answered for herself. "Myra," her voice small but clear. The man gave her a faint smile. "Nice to meet you both." They ate slowly, savoring every bite. The warmth from the stew spread through their bodies, and Lyara felt the shaking in her hands ease when the bowl was almost empty. She set the spoon down and looked at the man. "You don't know us," she said cautiously. "Why are you helping?" He leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "Because I can," he replied simply. His answer puzzled her. Most humans she met only helped if there was something in it for them. The door to the diner opened again, letting in a rush of cold air. 2 rough-looking men stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room until they landed on Lyara. Her heart sank. She recognized them. They had chased her from a supply yard a few nights ago, accusing her of stealing. One of them walked straight toward their table, his face twisted in a sneer. "You," he said, "thought you could hide." Mira's small hand tightened around her mother's arm. The other man stepped closer. "We should teach her a lesson," before Lyara could stand. The man who had brought them here rose from his seat. He moved between them and the table, his voice low but firm. "She's under my protection," he said. The two men looked at each other, then back at him. One snorted. "You'll regret that." They backed away, muttering curses as they left the diner. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Liara sat frozen, unsure what to say. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" The man turned back to her and shrugged. "Because no one else will." He sat down again and gestured toward the food. "Finish your meal." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. For the first time in a long time, she began to believe that maybe not all humans were the same. The rain had slowed outside, but the sound of drops hitting the diner's windows still filled the air. Mira leaned against her mother's side, her small stomach finally full for the first time in days. Liara sat quietly, still holding the last piece of bread in her hand, unsure if she should save it for later or eat it now. Across from them, the man was watching without pressing her to speak. There was no rush in his manner, no impatient tapping of fingers like other humans who only pretended to care. After a few minutes, he finally stood. "Come on," he said gently. "I've got something to show you." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, instinct warning her to be careful. She had followed people before and ended up in worse trouble, but there was something different about him. He had faced down those men earlier, without hesitation. She glanced at Mira, who was still clutching her blanket, and decided to trust him a little longer. They walked toward the back of the diner, passing the kitchen where the smell of roasting meat still lingered. The cook looked up, clearly curious, but said nothing. The man led them to a narrow hallway, stopping in front of a plain wooden door. When he opened it, a wave of warm air drifted out. Inside was a small room with faded wallpaper and a single lamp glowing softly in the corner. There was a bed pushed against the wall, neatly made with clean blankets, and a small heater humming quietly. It was simple, but compared to the cold street outside, it felt like a palace. Liara froze at the doorway, her heart tight in her chest. She didn't remember the last time she had been in a space that felt safe. Myra's eyes widened, and she stepped inside first, her little feet sinking into the worn rug. She ran to the bed and pressed her small hands into the blanket. Whispering something in their native tongue, Liara stepped in slowly, still unsure if they were truly allowed to be here. The man set down a folded towel and a small bag on the dresser. "There's a washroom just down the hall," he said. "Hot water if you need it." She turned to him, suspicion still flickering in her eyes. "Why?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Because I can't stand the thought of you going back out there tonight." Lyra's lips parted, but no words came out. For so long, she had relied on herself alone. Trust had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Now, standing in this warm little room, she didn't know whether to believe this was real. Myra sat on the bed, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders and smiling faintly. That smile pulled something inside Liara loose. She had not seen her daughter smile like that since before the war. The man stepped toward the door. "Rest tonight," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He left without asking for thanks, closing the door softly behind him. The quiet that followed was strange. Liara stood for a moment, listening to the heater's low hum. She reached out and touched the wall, feeling the solid warmth beneath her palm. Her knees felt weak, and she sat on the bed beside her daughter. Mira leaned into her eyes, already drooping from exhaustion. Liara brushed wet strands of hair from the child's face. For the first time in many nights, she let herself exhale slowly, but rest didn't come easily. Her mind replayed the events of the evening, the trash pile, the stranger's insults, the man's steady voice. She wondered what kind of human would risk trouble for an alien mother and child he didn't know. Was he hiding some other reason? Or was he truly that rare kind of person who helped without expecting anything? The thought unsettled her more than it comforted her. She had built a wall around her trust, and he was quietly finding the cracks. Mira's breathing grew steady, her small body warm against Leora's side. Leora looked down at her and felt the weight of her responsibility. No matter how tired she was, she had to protect this child. If the man's kindness turned to cruelty, she would take Myra and run again without hesitation. But for now, for tonight, she would allow herself to believe in the warmth of the room. She lay back slowly, pulling the blanket over them both. The bed creaked softly under their weight. Her eyes grew heavy, the day's exhaustion finally pulling her under. In the hallway outside, the man paused for a moment, listening to the muffled quiet from behind the door. He knew they didn't trust him yet, and he didn't expect them to, but he had made his decision. They would not be sleeping in the rain again, not while he was here. The next morning, pale sunlight slipped through the small window of the back room. It landed on Mira's sleeping face, making her silver-tinted skin glow softly. Leora was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, her bare feet resting on the warm rug. She had not slept deeply, but it was the first night in months she hadn't woken from fear or cold. Her eyes traced the lines of the room again, almost as if she expected it to vanish when she blinked. A knock came at the door, gentle but firm. She tensed instantly, her hand instinctively going to Myra's shoulder. "Come in," she said after a pause, her voice cautious. The man stepped inside, holding 2 mugs of steaming tea and a plate with bread and boiled eggs. He set them on the small dresser, without stepping closer. "You should eat," he said. "The kitchen's busy, so I brought it here." Leora studied him for a long moment. He was not smiling in that false way people use when they want something. He simply stood there, calm, waiting. Finally, she nodded and murmured, "Thank you." Mira stirred awake at the smell of food, rubbing her eyes before sitting up. Her little hands reached for the bread, and Leora let her take it without hesitation. The man leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I don't mean to pry," he began slowly, "but I think I should know who I'm helping." Lyra's chest tightened. This was the moment she had been avoiding. The truth was not something she shared freely, not with strangers, not with humans. Still, something in his steady gaze told her he would not be satisfied with silence. She lowered her eyes, speaking quietly. "We came from the Valen colony." He didn't react, so she continued. "It was attacked months ago." Her voice caught slightly, but she pushed on. "My mate stayed behind to fight, so we could escape." She could still see him in her mind, standing in the smoke and fire, telling her to run. She had carried Myra through the night, hiding in drainage tunnels and abandoned shuttles. "We had nothing when we arrived here," she said, "only the clothes on our backs." The man's jaw tightened slightly. He knew enough about the Valen attack to understand her words. "Carried the weight of loss. What happened after?" he asked, his tone. Even Leora gave a bitter laugh. "After? We survived. Barely." She told him how she had searched for work, only to be turned away from every door, how some offered work in exchange for other things, and how she had refused every time, how she and Mira had been sleeping under old roofs, eating whatever scraps she could find. Her voice grew quiet again. "This city doesn't want us." Myra finished her bread and climbed onto her mother's lap, resting her head against Leora's chest. Leora stroked her daughter's hair absent-mindedly. "I don't trust easily," she admitted, her eyes meeting his for the first time since she began speaking. "And yet, you fed us. You gave us this room." The man shifted slightly. "Because no one else will," he repeated. His tone was simple, but the weight behind it made her pause. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the sound of footsteps and distant chatter from the diner filled the silence. Leora looked toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in and take it all away. "You don't have to believe me yet," he said, reading her thoughts. "But I won't let anyone harm you, or your daughter." His words were steady, without drama, but they felt like a shield. Leora wanted to believe him. She truly did, but believing came with risk. She had trusted before and paid the price, and yet, here she was, sitting in a warm room with food in her hands, her daughter safe beside her. It was hard not to see this as something close to a miracle. The man stepped toward the door, pausing before leaving. "There's work if you want it," he said without looking back. "Nothing heavy, just helping in the diner, cleaning tables, maybe serving now and then." Lyra blinked, caught off guard. Work meant stability, even if only for a little while. "I'll think about it," she said softly. He nodded once and left. Closing the door quietly, Mira lifted her head. "Mama," she said, in their own language. "I like him." Liara smiled faintly, brushing a hand over her daughter's cheek. "I know, little one," she replied, "but we must still be careful." Still, deep inside, a small part of her dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this man was different. The day passed quietly in the small diner. Liara kept to herself. Helping clear tables in exchange for the warm room, she moved with silent steps, always keeping Myra close by. Customers came and went, some casting curious glances at the alien. Mother and child, most said nothing, but Liara could feel the weight of their stares. Myra stayed in the corner with a small stack of paper and crayons the man had found for her. For the first time in months, the little girl drew pictures instead of curling up in fear. As the evening came, the rain started again. It tapped against the diner's windows in a steady rhythm. The man whose name she had finally learned was Corin was at the counter, checking supplies. Liara was wiping a table when the front door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air. Two figures stepped inside, shaking rain from their jackets. The moment Liara saw their faces, her stomach tightened. It was the same pair of men from the other night, the ones who had tried to drag her away. They spotted her instantly. One smirked. "Well, look who's made herself comfortable." The other's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Mira. He grinned in a way that made Lyra's skin crawl. "Brought the brat too," he said, stepping closer. Liara instinctively moved between them and her daughter, her body tense. Mira pressed herself against her mother's side, clutching her. "Blanket." Corin's voice came from behind the counter, calm but sharp. "Is there a reason you're here?" The men exchanged glances. "We're here for what's ours," one said. "She stole from us food from our supply crates." Lyra's jaw tightened. "I took nothing from you," she said, her voice low but steady. "Liar." The taller one snapped. Stepping forward, Corin moved around the counter, placing himself between Liara and the men. "She's under my protection," he said, each word deliberate. The taller man laughed. "Protection? From you?" The shorter one looked at Corin with narrowed eyes. "You're making a mistake. She's trouble." Corin didn't flinch. "Leave," he said simply. The taller man's smile vanished, replaced by something colder. "You think you can stand against us?" His tone was mocking, but his body shifted like someone preparing for a fight. Lyra's heart pounded. She had seen confrontations like this before, and they rarely ended without violence. Her eyes darted to the door, calculating if she could grab Mira and escape before things turned ugly. But Corin didn't step back. Instead, he moved forward until the space between him and the taller man was nearly gone. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Leave." For a moment, the only sound was the rain outside. Then the shorter man muttered something under his breath and grabbed his companion's arm. "Not here," he said. "Not now." The taller man gave Corin a long, hard stare before backing toward the door. "This isn't over," he promised, pointing a finger at Liara. They left, the door slamming behind them, sending a shiver through the room. Corin turned back to Liara, his expression calm again. "They won't try anything here," he said. But Liara knew the look in those men's eyes. They weren't going to forget. Her hands were still shaking as she crouched to check on Mira. The little girl buried her face against her mother's chest, trembling. Liara stroked her hair and whispered something soft in their own language. She didn't care if Corin heard. The words were for Mira alone. Corin knelt down so he was at eye level with both of them. "I'll make sure they don't come back," he said, his voice steady. Liara met his eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation. There was none. She gave a small nod, still holding Myra close. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time, she meant it without doubt. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Liara kept replaying the moment in her mind. The way Corin had stepped forward without hesitation, the way the men had left, even though they clearly wanted to fight. It was rare for anyone to take her side so openly. Rarer still for them to follow through without expecting something in return. When the diner closed for the night, Corin locked the door and double-checked the windows. Liara watched him, realizing he wasn't just saying she was under his protection. He meant it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming. The men's threats weren't empty, and she knew how quickly safety could vanish. But for tonight, as she guided Mira back to the warm little room, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace. She knew she couldn't protect her daughter from everything, but maybe, with Corin standing between them and the world outside, they had a chance. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Sunlight spilled through the small window in the back room, painting warm patches of gold on the wall. Myra sat cross-legged on the bed, humming softly as she drew on a scrap of paper. Liara sat nearby, repairing the torn sleeve of her coat with a needle and thread she had found in a drawer. It felt strange to have quiet, to have a place where no one was shouting at them to leave. But even in this calm, she couldn't forget the night before. The memory of those two men's threats still lingered in the air like smoke. A knock came on the door. Liara looked up, already tense. When the door opened, it was only Corin, holding 2 cups of tea and a small plate of fresh bread. He set them on the dresser. "Thought you might want breakfast before it gets busy," he said. Mira's face lit up at the sight of the bread, and she reached for it instantly. Liara thanked him softly, though her voice still carried the caution she had not been able to shed. Corin didn't leave right away. Instead, he leaned against the doorway, watching her work on her coat. "You've got good hands," he said, nodding at the neat stitches. Liara shrugged. "I've had to fix things for a long time." Her voice carried a weight that made him pause. He knew she wasn't just talking about clothes. After a moment, he said, "I've been thinking." She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "You can't stay here forever," he continued. "But I don't want you going back to the streets either." Lyra's first instinct was to guard herself. She had heard offers before that ended badly, but Corin's voice stayed steady, without hidden tones. "I could use help in the diner," he said, "cleaning tables, washing dishes, keeping things in order." His eyes softened a little. "You'd get meals, a safe place to sleep, and some pay when I can spare it." Liara froze. It had been so long since someone had offered her work without asking for something else in return. Her hand stilled over the needle. "Why?" she asked quietly. The same question she had asked him before. His answer didn't change. "Because I can," for a long moment. The room was silent, except for the faint scratching of Mira's crayon on paper. Liara looked over at her daughter. She imagined Mira sleeping warm every night, eating real food every day. The thought was almost too much to believe, but fear still gnawed at her, fear that accepting would make her vulnerable again. "You don't know me," she said carefully. "You don't know what trouble I might bring." Corin shook his head. "I know enough, and I've already seen the kind of trouble that finds you, whether you ask for it or not." His words hit harder than she expected. She looked down at her hands, the thread still dangling between her fingers. Mira looked up from her drawing. "Mama, can we stay?" The child's voice was small, but full of hope. Lyra's throat tightened. She had promised herself she would never let Mira grow too attached to any place. But here was her daughter, already dreaming of staying. Finally, Liara nodded slowly. "I'll work," she said. Corin's mouth curved in the faintest smile. "Good," he replied. "We'll start after breakfast." It wasn't a big celebration. No dramatic moment. Just a quiet agreement that felt heavier than it looked. The rest of the day passed differently. Corin showed Liara where the cleaning supplies were. how to wipe down the tables so the wood stayed smooth. He didn't rush her, and when customers came, he didn't hide her in the back like others had. At first, some people still whispered, but when they saw her working quietly, and Myra playing in the corner, their eyes softened a little. Mira even shyly handed a customer a napkin, earning a smile in return. That night, after the last customer left and the diner lights dimmed, Liara sat at one of the tables. Tired, but not in the way she used to be. This was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from work, not from running. Corin brought her a plate of stew and bread, setting it down without a word. When she looked up at him, he simply nodded and walked away. She realized then that maybe, just maybe, he truly didn't expect anything beyond what he had said. Still, as she walked Myra back to their small room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the men from before hadn't forgotten. Kindness was rare, and in her experience, it always came with shadows following close behind. But tonight, as Mira laughed softly at something in her drawing, decided that for now, she would take the risk, because for the first time in far too long, the future didn't feel impossible. Weeks passed, and the cold nights of the streets became a memory that slowly faded. The small back room of the diner turned into a home for Liara and Mira. It wasn't large, but it was warm, safe, and smelled faintly of bread and spices from the kitchen every morning. Liara woke to the sound of Mira humming or softly talking to herself while drawing. It was a sound she hadn't heard since the days before the war, a sound that made her chest ache and heal at the same time. In the diner, Liara moved with quiet confidence now. She carried trays, cleaned tables, and sometimes even served drinks with a polite smile. At first, customers kept their distance, still wary of the alien woman working among them. But day by day, their stares grew softer. Some began to greet her, others left coins in the tip jar with a nod. Mira became a familiar sight too, sitting in the corner with her crayons, sometimes helping by handing customers napkins or stirring sugar into their tea. Corin never made speeches about what he had done for them. He simply worked alongside them, showing by example that they belonged here. Whenever someone made a comment about aliens taking jobs, he met their eyes and said calmly, "She earns her place." Liara had never asked him to defend her, but each time he did, a small part of her heart warmed. It was not just about shelter anymore, it was about dignity. One afternoon, as Liara was wiping down the counter, Corin approached quietly. "You've been here a while now," he said. "You've done good work." Liara looked up, unsure where he was going with this. "I was thinking," he continued, "if you want to stay, I can make it official, regular pay. Hours that work for you and Mira, your room included." The offer made her pause completely. Her hands tightened around the cloth she was holding. A real job, a real home, things she hadn't dared to dream of. She searched his face, looking for hidden motives, but found none. Instead, she found the same steady gaze he had worn the first night they met. Mira, who had been listening from the corner, jumped up. "Mama, say yes." Liara laughed softly, a sound that still felt strange in her own mouth. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Corin smiled, not a wide smile, but the kind that carried weight. "Good," he replied. Then, it settled. From that day on, things changed even more. Liara began to feel less like a guest and more like part of something. She started learning the little details of the diner, which customers liked extra sugar, which chairs wobbled, which nights were busiest. Mira had her own small table in the corner with crayons, paper, and a little vase where she kept flowers she found outside. The vase became a small tradition. Every time Mira placed a new flower in it, Liara felt like they were planting a piece of themselves here. Still, the memory of the two men who had threatened them never left her mind. Sometimes she saw them in the street, watching from a distance, but they never came inside the diner again. She suspected Corin had something to do with that. He never told her what he said or did. and she never asked. Some battles, she realized, were fought quietly, without the other person even knowing. One night, after closing, Liara stood outside the diner for a moment. The air was cool, but not bitter, the sky clear enough to see a few faint stars. Mira stood beside her, holding her hand. "Mama," she said, in their own language, "are we staying here forever?" Liara looked down at her daughter, the glow of the diner's light behind them. "I think we've already started," she replied. Corin stepped out, locking the door, and glanced at them. "Everything all right?" he asked. Liara gave him a small smile. "Better than all right," she said. The three of them walked down the street together, the warm light of the diner fading behind them, but not from their hearts. For the first time in years, Liara felt that the future was not something to fear, it was something to build, piece by piece, with steady hands and small acts of kindness. And as the night air wrapped around them, she realized that maybe this was what a new beginning really looked like. Not loud, not sudden, but quiet and certain, like the slow rising of the sun after a long cold night.